There, yeah. Once
Whoa, there it is. It's really hot though.
I don't know what I'm talking about. All the usual brand. Well, you don't mind the pension. They can't change my pension. I'm protected by the Constitution. I don't think what do you think the Constitution convention is? Vote anywhere you like.
No.
Nothing?
But
Let me bring this up just a
One
little.
this, two, the other thing.
Still nothing? You got it?
The legislature.
see what that sounds like.
Yeah. You can test it, so we know.
Well,
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing, testing. I'll go through the thing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Testing, testing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Good? All right.
I understand you. I'm aware you want that.
We're about to bring the meeting to order. Everybody here except Mitra. This is the September meeting of the Commission on Compensation. We are going to continue today some discussions we had at our last meeting. I'd just like to make some comments. That is, first, we've had numbers of people sending letters, emails, etc. Since our last meeting. All of that information has been useful. It has all been distributed to all of the commissioners. And one in particular I'd like to make reference to, which is on our website, from one of the members of the New York State Assembly that just came in last week. And if I hope I don't butcher your name, Rodney's Bichot, which was a very interesting take on some of the issues we're talking about. The commissioners have read that with interest, and there have been a number of other people from the Assembly or the Senate who have contacted us. So we are reviewing all of that material. This morning, I was handed a survey, a non-scientific survey, but a survey from the, sorry, I lost the piece of paper, but it's a survey done by one of the TV stations up in Rochester. As you know, we canceled our Rochester meeting because of the fact that we had no one signed up to testify, and they have done a survey of their listeners, and they have put together and just given me this morning the results of that survey, which included about 1,500 some odd people. We will review it. None of the commissioners have seen this yet, because I just got it this morning. We will put on our website the conclusions, but I don't think it's proper, because there are names and email addresses of people, to put the names and email addresses of the people that submitted this to the survey, submitted this to the TV station. So I will distribute this to our commissioners, and they can take that into consideration as well. I think that's all of the introduction. The meeting is now open. At our last meeting, I think we had some suggestions on what to do with the executive salaries and the commissioners, and we had some early discussions as what our thoughts were with regard to the legislature. So I opened it up for any comments of how we should proceed. Yeah.
I had made a suggestion last time that had some specific numbers associated with them, and they were based on essentially inflation, and a concept of, well, and let's make the number sound like a reasonable round number. And I had started with the A commissioners, and the number that I had used was a $200,000 number for A commissioners, which was roughly a 47% in the aggregate pay raise. I wanted to first put that into context and then add a thought that has come to our attention since then. If I were to look at that number as an annual number, which is the way I think people talk about pay raises, what was the annual increase? That's about a 2.2% over the time frame that we're looking at. That depends a little bit on how you count the years, whether it's 17 or 18, and that's whether end of the year or beginning of the year that we're in right now. But if I take it as an 18-year period, it's 2.2%. And to me, that's a modest increase. I understand in the aggregate that adds up to a big number because it's been a long time. That having been said, that $200,000 number was a number related to the A commissioners. We just got a letter from the budget director. I just got it this morning. And he indicated, gee, we're having a real problem with our commissioner recruitment process because there are a lot of people turning us down. Our salary isn't competitive. And that's certainly a point that I was trying to make along the way. I agree with that. I think that's a concern. It's a major concern from my point of view that public sector employment be at least minimally attractive. It doesn't have to be like competitive with the private sector, but it's got to be attractive enough that people will actually take the job, even at some personal sacrifice. And so 200,000 to me that's such a big number, such a big increase, that was a little intimidating to me. But what the letter from the budget director indicates, he looked at a number of states and a number of positions, and the two that I fastened on for purposes of illustration were the state police commissioner and the equivalent of the Department of Corrections commissioner. And to my way of thinking, the round number that summarizes the two numbers that he gave us for California was $240,000. That's a little bit more than the state police commissioner and a little bit less than the corrections commissioner. And what was clear across the board is that the various states that he used to illustrate his point, wow, very different notions about what the relative merits of different positions are. I don't think I'm in a position to try to get into rearranging or reshuffling. I would have different priorities than what they had, but the point is we have a classification system. They're called A commissioners, and it's the big agencies. And to my way of thinking, so let's look at them, and then let's look at a couple that were comparable. 240 was that number for the two that to me were the easy ones to grab a hold of, the public safety positions in California. If I said that's the number, then my 136 for A commissioners goes to 240. Well, wow, that's a pretty big number increase, but as an annual number, it's 3.2%. It's not a big percentage increase. It's a pretty startling number, so I guess I would reframe my observations of last time as, how about something in the range of 200 to 240 as the range that we should be considering for the A commissioners, and everything else should be proportionate. Legislature, lieutenant governor, governor, I know we don't get to do lieutenant governor, governor, but I think that should be part of our thought process. And certainly we are supposed to do the Attorney General and the Comptroller. So again, everything proportionate, whatever those numbers are. I didn't try to recalculate all of the various numbers, but the B commissioners would be a little bit less than 240. The C commissioners would be a little less than that. The E commissioners be a fair amount less than that. Me personally, I would say move the Agriculture Department up a bit. I think that safety inspection stuff that they do is pretty important stuff. I think we devalue that too much. But again, I don't think that we're in a position to kind of go through and reshuffle that deck very well. I would do the same thing for the legislature, proportionate. Last time, I didn't include any thoughts on the stipend, but in my mind, and I should have said something then, but in my mind, those are proportionate as well. I think that could be a separate discussion for us, but insofar as I kind of made a proposal last time and gave the rationale for it, I guess my proposal I would like to modify and say 200 to 240, and everything proportionate, and by everything, I mean everything.
Okay, yes, Jim.
Of course, we just got this letter dated yesterday, this morning, when I walked in, Mindy handed it to me. I hadn't seen it before. It wasn't even sent out by email. I've known Bob Mojica since he was the most junior Senate staffer, and I was in the Senate, so that's obviously a very long time ago. He's one of the brightest guys I know, and I've just read the letter. I think a lot of the things he's saying and Roman is saying makes a lot of sense, and obviously vastly increases the numbers we've talked about, and I don't mind thinking about it. I'm certainly not going to finish the thinking of those thoughts today in doing so. As I said, we just got this letter. It is very interesting. It is very good. As I said, Bob Mojica is a very thorough guy. I'd like some time to digest it, and we'll have to come back and discuss it. We have almost 2 months, and I think that's a very, very good idea. And I'm glad we finally got something like this that we can put our teeth into and look at. But I think that the time is there. And by the way, if we're going to do, and I think we have to, in light of that letter, I know we closed the hearing to taking people in, but I read Assemblymember Bichat, I don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly either, was very interesting. Looked her up, she's a graduate engineer with an MBA, in addition to everything else, and just the type of person I've mentioned here many a time, a junior member of the Assembly majority who could wait 8 years to get anything in terms of legislative allowances, who is living totally on the salary she receives as a full-time member of the legislature. She points that out. Quite frankly, since in light of Bob Mojica's letter, we're going to have another meeting, I would like to open that up, bring her in, and get testimony from her. In addition to the written, I think we should meet her and talk to her. She's just the type young person who is running and has become a member of the Assembly that we need to hear from and get ideas from. So if we're going to do that, I'd like to bring her in, and if there's, I haven't seen at all the Rochester figures you're talking about. If somebody wants to come down from Rochester, talk whatever they want, fine, by all means. I think we should schedule a meeting and do that.
Okay. We'll talk about that in a minute. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, my fellow commissioner and I actually agree on something, which is that that I think that there's a real case to be made for an additional public hearing. Our reasons are a little different, but I'm glad to hear that he's supportive of that. We have 2 months. Given how busy everyone here is and how difficult it has been to schedule our meetings, we are coming to the end of our work, and decisions are going to have to be made. I've given a lot of thought to where I am as it pertains to the legislature right now. That may change, but where I am right now. And I'd like to put a statement into the record regarding my thoughts about that, which actually includes some of what Jim has just raised.
Could you just wait one moment on
Sure.
that, Fran? I just would like to get the sense of the commission about another hearing. Are we all in favor of having a public hearing here in New York in September is gone already, in October? Is everyone in favor of doing that?
What I would say to that, Sheila, is that I'm very much in favor of it. I think that she has made her case in writing, given that she didn't think she would have the opportunity. If she's the only person from the Assembly or the Senate who want to come forward, I'm not sure we need to reconvene to hear one person.
Yeah, but I think
But-
that there's been a lot more, that there have been more than one person that has requested to be heard.
Good,
And
okay.
we'll get back to all of those people and
Yep.
tell them that specifically, and get out the word that we'll have another hearing. So if everybody's in favor of that, after the meeting, let's discuss a time when all or most of us can be present, and then Mindy, our trustee guide, will take the next steps. Okay? All right, I'm sorry now. Now I'd like
Quite
to
all right.
listen.
Okay, so, and I'd like this, I'm doing this really because I would like it as part of the record. I will hand out copies of it to all of you and request that it go up on our website. The New York State Commission on Legislative, Judicial, and Executive Compensation, as we call it, the Commission, of which I am a member, has been charged with examining, evaluating, and making recommendations with respect to salary adjustments for members of the judiciary, the legislature, and certain executive officers. To that end, we have engaged in numerous public hearings and done substantial research, first with regard to the judiciary. At those hearings, we heard from a number of witnesses representing the judiciary in person and via written submissions, who individually and collectively presented a substantive case for the salary increases the Commission ultimately recommended. The events surrounding our investigation of potential legislative salary increases have been very different. This is likely the last scheduled hearing before the Commission makes its final recommendation. Obviously, I wrote this before we made the decision we just made. To date, we have heard from only 3 legislators, one of whom testified in support of a salary cut. We have neither heard nor received written testimony from the leadership of either the Assembly or Senate, making an institutional argument for a salary increase. During the time of these hearings, it appears that more legislators are making public statements against the raise than for it, and some legislators are actually saying they won't accept it. Then why would this Commission ever recommend it? At the same time, public sentiment via testimony and written submissions has been unanimous in its rejection of any legislative salary increase. Based on all we have heard, it is my opinion that there is no possible justification for this Commission to recommend any legislative pay raise whatsoever. Therefore, I am requesting that we reach out formally to the leadership and members of the New York State Assembly and Senate and invite them to provide the input so sorely lacking from our deliberations. Among the basic issues that need to be addressed if we are to consider a pay raise, do you believe the annual salary and/or allowances of members of the legislature warrant an increase? If so, why and how much? And to what extent should Lulus and travel expenses be considered? If the legislators will participate, we should schedule an additional public hearing at which they can be heard and answer the Commission's questions before we reconvene to determine our final recommendations. Absent the willingness of the legislature to contribute meaningful insight for our consideration, I do not see how the Commission has the basis on which to counter the overwhelming public sentiment objecting to such increases. I have made most of these points at several times during our meetings. I continue to be extremely concerned that we have not heard from them in any official way. And I think before we really get into our deliberations, we need to give them one more opportunity to do so. But I would ask, if my fellow commissioners agree, that you extend that formal invitation to them, both to individuals who want to appear, but I would suggest also representatives of the leadership of the 2 houses to come here and make their case. We've had a lot of discussion amongst ourselves about the propriety of them doing that. I think there have been a couple of people who thought that that was not a proper thing to ask them to do. I have disagreed with that point of view from the beginning of our discussions. I see no reason why it's an improper thing to do. I think anybody who wants a raise, anyone, has an obligation to tell their employer, and in this case, their employer are the people of the state of New York, to make their case as to why they deserve a raise, and I don't believe they've done that. I'm glad we received the letter, the testimony from the young new Assembly member. But I think we need to hear much more than one newcomer's view of this. And I want to give them every opportunity to do that before we make a decision. Because if we called it for a vote today, I don't see how we have the basis for granting a pay increase.
Thank you, Fran. I think you've put on the table a very important issue for us to consider, and It was very clear-cut, and I would ask the commissioners whether there are any objections to asking the leadership to respond and inviting them to the hearing. They may not want to appear in person, but they could give us written responses. So let's have any discussion that anyone thinks is necessary. Barry?
I certainly support making the request as a final, I think, entreaty to the leadership for some direct input, whether it's testimonial input or written input. I am concerned about, the time frame in terms of where we are, because I think while we do have a couple of months to complete the process, it will not be that easy if we're talking about having several meetings before that time. So my only caveat would be, we need to ask for that input, and it needs to be submitted within a time certain, whether it's 10 days or 2 weeks, so that we have that, so that we have an opportunity to review that, and then consider that before we start to deliberate. So that would be at least my view with respect to it, but I certainly have no objection. I think it certainly would be helpful to hear from the leadership on this.
Anyone else want to be heard on this issue? Yes.
I've said this before, and I want to reiterate this. I think the whole point in setting up a commission was to make it so that the agency heads and the legislature and the governor and the comptroller and the attorney general and so forth didn't have to publicly say anything, that we were making the decision on their behalf, on behalf of the people, that we were created for the purposes of removing this from the political process. I think that worked well with respect to the judges. I think it should work well here. I certainly am not in a position to veto anything, so I don't want to make it sound as though I'm trying to. But I think it's something we ought to consider seriously as, ooh, wow, wasn't this kind of missing the point for us to ask them to do something that they set out to not do?
Well, but that's-
It was to depoliticize. And the fact that a number of people running for office, particularly non-incumbents, have said, gee, I'm against, wow, that's exactly the grandstanding that I was hoping we could avoid. And now, we didn't avoid it completely, we got the grandstanding. So I understand, but I want to say this as more in the way of a lament than anything else. Wow, did we miss our own point?
I have to say, and I've said it before, we are going to make the decision. They did this so that they didn't have to make that decision because of the politics involved, and we are going to make that decision, Roman, ultimately. But the notion that they should not have to make a case for something, I find completely separate from that notion. I don't believe it politicizes it. You can't do anything about. There was no way this was ever going to be totally non-political. It's too much of a hot button issue. So we can't have any control over what people running for office may or may not do with something like this. But the notion that it's not a political issue, even if we make the decision, I think is just unrealistic. But for them to have to come in and make a case, it would not be appropriate for commissioners to make the case. It would be appropriate for the person who they report to make the case. And I'm delighted that the executive has in fact sent us, finally, a submission making the case very succinctly for raises for the commissioners. I'm delighted they did that. So the governor, in effect, has weighed in. The executive has weighed in. The judges who are normally the least political of all of the people we're dealing with, who are some of them elected, right, where there were all kinds of restrictions on them raising money and campaigning and all of that, they felt they felt it was perfectly appropriate to come before here, and leaders from within the judicial community, and make a very, very cogent argument, a rationale for getting a salary increase. We disagreed a little bit in terms of how much, but there was no disagreement after they got done making their case as to the rightness, if you will, of giving them a salary increase. There has been no institutional presentation here, and very, very little by individuals coming forward and making such a case for members of the legislature, and in the midst of great discussion about the reluctance of the legislature to take certain actions and reforms and enact reforms of their own bodies and the way the legislature does business, that frankly would have been very positive in terms of our deliberations. So I'm just telling you, I can only speak for myself, that given how little input they have had, if we took a vote today, I would not vote for a legislative salary increase.
And we're not taking a vote
No,
today.
I'm just saying, I want to give them
An opportunity.
the greatest opportunity to make their case. I think they've had a real opportunity to do it. They haven't taken it. Let's give it one more shot. But in terms of the propriety, that this commission was supposed to take the place of their making their case for a raise, on that, I respectfully disagree.
Gary and...
I just wanted to briefly support and endorse Fran's statement, and she stole a little on my thunder because her original presentation hadn't addressed the political nature of what we're doing. I think this ultimately is a political process. It's a different device, but it's a political process. And right now we find ourselves in a circumstance where what we've heard from the electorate is that they are opposed to legislative pay raises. And we've essentially heard from the legislature silence. So the legislature's position is essentially the status quo at this point. And I don't think, even though we will not stand for election ourselves and will go out of existence when we make this report, we have to be responsive to the electorate. And if that ball is going to be moved at all, I think it's necessary for the legislature to weigh in and make a case for why this is appropriate and why it is something that the electorate perhaps needs to be educated to understand why it is an appropriate thing to do to raise legislative pay.
Jim?
Well, I have no objection if you certainly want to send the legislature this request. I would also not be surprised if you don't receive an answer. The reason we are sitting here is that for 18 years, it has been impossible for the legislature and executives, whoever they might be, Republican and Democrat, to agree upon a salary raise for commissioners and legislators for all the reasons that you can spell out with the word politics. As a result, finally, following the lead established by then Chief Judge Jonathan Littman, we were attached to what was a Judiciary Salary Increase Commission. It was established in 2011 to be reconvened in 2015, which it was by repealing that commission and establishing as Chapter 60 of those laws in 2015. This commission, because of the political impossibility of getting the legislative and executive salary increases all those years. For those who think that we were created out of whole cloth someplace, we were created just by a chapter of law. In order to do that, bills had to be introduced in the Senate and the Assembly, reviewed with and by the governor, passed by the Senate and the Assembly, signed into law, Chapter 60, creating us by the governor. That was an indication, obviously, by both houses of the legislature, both parties, that the time has come to revamp the legislative and executive compensation. Honestly, I'm sure they didn't do it to diminish their salaries, but to increase their salaries. And that's why we're here, in the middle of a political election season. And I can't help noting that the second that was mentioned here about where is the legislature, suddenly within days, 5 or 6 candidates for a state senate, which of course is the closely contested house of the legislature, suddenly issued, we don't want salary raises. And that started like a bowling ball down the alley to knock over the pins of all over the state, members of both political parties, particularly in the Senate, saying, oh no, we don't want salary increases. No, if we're elected, we're not going to take them, et cetera. All the reasons that point out to why for 18 years it was impossible to get that done. And so for us to think that because of all that, that the legislature is going to come here and make statements that for 18 years it was impossible to do, but they should come before us, which was created by them to do what they've not been able to do, although obviously want to do, which is why we're sitting here as volunteers doing it. Okay, but I would not be surprised if we don't get an answer from them. We have the answer. They would like salary adjustments. What that adjustment should be, the legislature purposely is not getting involved saying it should be 2%, 25%, 42%. That Bob Mahika's letter for $240,000 for 8 commissioners might be the answer. That's what we're supposed to decide, and they've turned it over to us to make that decision. To expect them to come in and to justify or to ask for a specific number is quite frankly saying, please come here and do what you haven't done for 18 years, but now that you created us, come here and do it anyway.
Well,
Good luck.
it presupposes, Jim, that you get a raise simply because cost of living goes up and time passes, and they haven't been able to do that. I would suggest that as public servants, part of the decision, we're still going to make the decision. You seem to think that by them showing up here and making a case for it, other than we haven't gotten one in 19 years, I don't think that's enough to, we've done all kinds of research, right? We've done our due diligence. We've looked at other states. In fact, our salaries are not way out of whack. There are exactly 2 states out of 50 that have higher legislative salaries than we do, California and Pennsylvania. They are not that much higher than ours, and when you throw in the Lulus that a lot of people get, some of our people end up getting more than that. We continue to call ours a part-time. Those 2 states are full-time legislatures. If you look around the country, one of the things we were supposed to do and do comparisons, just as the executive did comparisons of a whole bunch of states in terms of executive pay, when you look at that, I could make an argument that $79,900 plus their per diems is not an outrageously low number, right? I'm not prepared to do that. I'm not unsympathetic to giving a raise, particularly to some who don't get to take advantage of Lulus and all of that, and those who live in New York City who have a higher cost of living. These are all things that we should weigh in doing this. But I also know that this is a body that has refused to do any kind of reforms that have been called for by every good government group that's appeared before us, not to mention all that we read from news outlets. They're not doing that either. So I think all of that comes into play in terms of the decision, the independent decision we're going to make. That's what we've been charged with. On that we agree. But the notion that it should be done without their input, again, I respectfully disagree with that notion. They are political beings. They are elected government representatives. This is the way we decided to govern ourselves as a nation and as a state. They have to answer to the public. They may not want to make the decision. I understand that, and they haven't been able to, so we'll do it. But I want their input, and I think I deserve their input, and I think the public deserves that input, and then we'll make the decision. And you know what? I don't believe the public is the last word on this. I'm not suggesting that the fact that that's the public that has been almost unanimous. I think they have been unanimous in their opposition to any kind of salary increase. Yes, I'm going to weigh that, but I wish I had something that they were prepared to step up and say to counter that. And my point in my statement was that, barring that input, I don't know how you can justify countering the public's reaction to the notion of giving them pay raises.
Okay, I think everybody has stated their position, and let me just try to put it into a motion, because I think it's something that we should probably vote on, and that is to invite the majority leader, the minority leader, the leadership of the state assembly and senate to answer some questions, no matter how we'll see how we put it, or to come and testify at our next hearing, which we have voted to have in October, on respond either in writing or orally in that hearing, to get further information with regard to the legislature. Is there anyone opposed to that?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I think it's a mistake to insist that we have input from the legislature as an entity. Republican, Democrat, majority, minority. I'm indifferent on the detail of it. I think the idea of it is to miss the point of the creation of the commission. That having been said, I'm certainly not unavailable. I don't mean it that way. But I think it is something that is a bad idea from an institution, this institution, point of view. We are the ones that are supposed to make a decision on the merits of and the reason for any pay increases for the group of people that we were charged to evaluate and make decisions about. That is to say, the executive agencies, a couple of the elected agency heads, and the legislature, just as we did for the judiciary. The input that we get is certainly important, but in the end, it's a decision by this group, and that having been said, to condition it on the participation of particular institutions or particular individuals, I think is a mistake.
That's an individual decision, though. In other words, I'm not suggesting that they have to, or we're not going to,
I understand. So you asked about sort of sentiment, and my sentiment is I would be opposed to asking them.
I would second that.
All right.
And I just want to, in regards to Roman's comment, I mean, I don't see us as either insisting or conditioning anything that we do on getting a response from the leadership.
But Fran's statement does that.
No. My personal
No.
vote. I have the right to condition my ultimate decision on this any way I want to.
Sure,
right?
and for every commissioner who doesn't come and testify,
I don't want the commissioners here.
No, exactly. I don't want them here.
I don't think they're the appropriate person to do it.
I don't want them to.
Okay.
I don't want the legislators either.
Well, we have had some legislators already here, and we
Sure.
have another legislator
Understood.
in the audience that I'll introduce you to later, who certainly has an interest.
Yeah, but no one set up a requirement that the leadership of the legislature show up here to do anything. We're in the middle of a political election season, as everybody at this table knows, with some very hotly contested partisan elections going on, for which, not from anything we've done, but because we exist, have become election issues. And to expect those in the midst of that to come in the middle of that, to come here and testify, as it were, so what's going on, which involves, in effect, their own elections as well as the election and leadership of their particular house of the legislature. Having run and been elected to the legislature 12 times, I can tell you that is not something that any legislator, and I think that's what Roman was talking about, any legislator of either party in either house is really something he wants to do in the middle of an election. particularly a highly contested election, of which there are many, which thankfully there are. It's a democratic process that is going on throughout the state. But I don't think anybody wants to bring it into the Association of the Bar.
Barry?
I guess I'm somewhere in between on this. I mean, I do support the fact that we have the right to request broad input, and that we should be as comprehensive as possible in considering the various viewpoints that may be expressed. I don't think that there is anything that precludes us from making the request. I however, depart, I guess, from Fran and the suggestion, I believe, that the lack of input from the legislative leaders in some way may be preclusive in terms of our consideration as to whether or not they get a raise. I separate those two items.
I think
because,
that's an individual prerogative. I'm not
exactly.
suggesting
Okay,
we
well,
should
let me
all-
finish. Let me
you know.
finish. And the reason I say that is because I believe that we as a commission have an independent responsibility pursuant to the legislation to evaluate and to make appropriate recommendations. And to me, those are not governed by any single consideration. So, you know, I don't want to elevate it to the point of saying, gee, if the legislature doesn't respond, then we know because the consensus is there shouldn't be, and even on this question of public consensus, we have anecdotal information. We have nothing that would be the equivalent or the semblance of a public consensus because we haven't heard but from dozens of persons as such. Not even hundreds of persons have we heard from. So to say that there is a public consensus, the fact of the matter is the public is not in a great position to evaluate this particular circumstance. It's difficult enough for us to evaluate it with the amount of information that we have. But we do have a responsibility to the public, and certainly we have to discharge that responsibility whether or not we get input from legislative leaders. So to the extent they can't be compelled, and we understand
Of course
that,
not.
but I have no objection to the request.
So I think there's a majority of the commission that would like to invite the leaders of the Assembly and the Senate to respond. I think as Barry made very clear, the fact that they do or don't will not in the end affect our decision, mostly. Some people it might. But with that caveat, I think we have majority, and we will get out a request as soon as possible, and invite them to attend the next meeting if they'd like, or to respond in writing. Does that sort of reflect the majority? I think it does. Okay. What else do we want to go back and have a discussion? I would assume that based on what we're talking about, that we should put off any discussion of the legislative salaries to the next meeting, or is there more to discuss on that? Silence means
I'd put it off to the next meeting.
Okay. So are we prepared to discuss more as to how to handle the commissioners at this point, even without maybe taking a vote and vote on both of them at our next meeting?
Well, not really. We just got this letter from Bob
Okay,
Mohica.
and you want more time to consider that as well?
Well, it raises the bar, as it were,
Right.
substantially. I mean,
Just keep in mind that Roman sort of put a suggestion on the table that we go up to between 200 and 240, so
That's
that's
all.
at least a suggestion that we can consider.
I would just ask for consideration of one other approach, which is a little bit different.
Okay?
Because I I believe that the comparison is incredibly helpful in illustrating just how poorly our folks are paid, and gives a real foundation to the assertion that this is a big part of why we have such a hard time filling these vacancies. I don't know that, and I haven't read Rob's letter yet, having just received it. I don't know that the executive is necessarily making a case that what we do needs to match, as an example, what California does, right? I see the 200 range being a little bit more in keeping. It's a little more in line with where my thinking was, the bottom of that. But the other thing I would ask everyone to consider is that the notion of a set cost of living increase that we calculate, that 47% that you raise. Certainly in terms of our discussion about the executive, I have a little bit of an issue with, only because there are, in the course of being a public servant, there are years when states, governments can afford raises and years when they can't. And while that won't necessarily apply to employment contracts that are arrived at through collective bargaining for other kinds of government employees, at the highest levels there are years when you can afford to give a raise, and then you go into a recessionary period and the cost of living may continue to go up, but there's no way government can afford to give a raise under those circumstances. We discussed 1 or 2 meetings ago a slightly different approach, which is to take a look at the raises that in fact government has provided for its other managerials over the course of this period of no raises for the commissioners, those MC increases, and use that number, which is a little bit lower than, not hugely lower, but a little bit lower. I think it was around, Gary, 42%.
42%.
And to look at that as sort of the rationale, as we come up with a number, a salary increase, if in fact we're endorsing a salary increase ultimately for them, because that's a number that's tied into sort of the realities of year-to-year governance, right? A guaranteed, computing it on a yearly cost of living increase simply only reflects the cost of living increase, not the budgetary realities that government may be facing in any given year. So the MCs can go 4 years without a raise and then all of a sudden get a 3.5% raise, right? So what I'd like to do is take the numbers that Gary pulled and look at that as the basis for a possible raise, that over that 19-year period, there was approximately a 42% increase that they got. That's exactly how they got ahead of the commissioners in terms of salaries, right? And that we tie it to that so that the raise they get immediately puts them ahead of all of their executive deputy commissioners. And something that I have sort of put out there before is that we only deal with a 4-year period, but that in each of the next 4 years, at any point, the other managerials get a raise.
They get a raise.
The commissioners get the same percentage raise, so that we never run into this issue of them making less than the people that report to them. So I think it's a little smaller number, but it doesn't set any kind of precedent in terms of tying it to a cost of living increase, because I think that's a very slippery slope to impose on government when the fiscal situation in government at any one time simply may not be able to support that.
So, I'm sorry, you want to respond?
Just with a nuance, and it is and how do we think that through kind of nuance? The 42% number is one group of employees that went through the history that we're talking about. And it is, in rough terms, over the 18-year period, 2% per year. If we were to look at another group of employees who are also senior and are subject to the state's budgetary constraint because it's part of a negotiation process, it's the PEF employees, and their raise over that same period was not 2%, but was 2.2%. That's the 47.
Okay.
That turns out to be cost of living. Which came first, I think, is a fair question. The 3% that is implicit in 3.2, actually, in the 240 number that I used at the beginning today, that's a little bit more than inflation. It's trying to deal with one concept of who's comparable, and I use California. I think that's the range in my thoughts, someplace in that 2% to 3.2% per year over the history that we're looking at to catch up. Not to say that's what it has to be going forward. It's to catch up. And so that's the nuance that I guess I would put on the table. And that translates to something like 192 to 240 as the range for the A commissioners. And then my comment was, and everybody else proportionally.
Yeah, I have no problem, by the way, with the everybody else proportionally. I agree totally with you that we're not in a position to
I would
reorder
include the
them.
legislature. That's the
Well,
difference between us.
That is the difference between us. The only thing, and it's a pretty big difference, but I'm glad we can agree on at least one of them. The only thing I would say is that I think that contracts that are agreed to through collective bargaining, and any of the union employees that work in government, is a different kettle of fish, so to speak, and that tying it to those increases, which are arrived at in a very, very different way, is a little bit apples and oranges. But I think we're close enough that I have every confidence we're going to be able to come up with an agreement on this.
And I think whatever justification any of the commissioners needs to reach their number may be their own justification. But there could be a number we could agree to, and people can approach it in their own way to justify it, because it seems to me that the numbers, whichever way you go, are not that far apart. Gary, I'm sorry, I know you.
Yeah, I wanted to speak too.
Okay.
I just wanted to suggest a possible way of thinking about this, presuming that we get over the hurdle of justifying a raise, and that is to consider the possibility of parity with the Supreme Court justices, where we have them at 193 in 2016 and 2031 in 2018. And it certainly seems to me that if you were talking about an A-level commissioner, it would not be outrageous that that A-level commissioner would have parity with a Supreme Court justice.
As I said, it's just very interesting. There are different ways to get there, but we're all hovering around certain numbers. Jim?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick on something that Fran said in order to have department heads, commissioners, regardless of their level, making better salaries than those who report to them. You can, and we have not, and I'm not even saying we should, apply that to the legislature. There is, I don't know how many senior staff members, Roman, you probably know more in the assembly than I do, how many senior staff people in the assembly and the Senate who earn 50, 70% more than the speaker or the majority leaders in the Senate, all of whom are full-time, which is obviously now a change in the 18-year process that we've had. Both the two leaders in the Senate who share leadership responsibilities and the speaker are full-time employees and have stated so, and indeed that's what they're doing. And to the best of my knowledge, they earn $60,000, $70,000 less than people who report to them. I just add that on as a codicil to what Fran was talking about how they must feel to have people who work for them make that much more than they do.
I would suggest that elected officials are a different breed and a different class, and who run for, I mean, we've got legislatures around this country, and I'm sure they have staff people as well, where they're uncompensated completely. There are different reasons for becoming a state legislator than there are for becoming a staff member, and I you know, I simply, I don't buy into the analogy of the two, that's all.
Okay, is there any other issues that we need to raise today or decide? I think it's going to be a busy month. If we go forward, we will discuss right after the meeting what dates we will have, and they will put them on our website immediately so people can be aware of them, to fit all these, another hearing in and another meeting in October. I'd like to introduce you before we go to Assembly Person Bishop, who is present today. And I know you wanted to testify. We are going to set up another date for that. But if you want to say a couple of words, you came all this way today, and we appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I came today just to listen to the panel. I have another event I have to go to, but I had respected the protocols and just wanted to listen to the feedback. And I certainly look forward to the next time in October. Hopefully it's not October 20th or 21st. I'll be out of town. But I look forward to actually communicating the feedback, the concerns to my colleagues in government. So
We appreciate that.
yes.
And I must say, before you came in, we did comment on your very, very worthwhile letter explaining.
Erudite.
Erudite, too. Worthwhile and erudite. Explaining a position that I think had not been explained to us before in such an erudite way. So we thank you for your written comments. If you want to testify at our next hearing, we'd love to have you. But you have added great value to our considerations. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Any other business before the commission? I call this meeting to a close. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Guys, can we first figure out when we can meet?
Turn off.
Are these off?